Okay, hi everyone. This is our first lecture of Psych 311, Correlational Research Methods in Psychology. And my goal for this lecture is really very simple. It's to convince you that we need good research methods in psychology. I know that most of us are probably in this class because it's a requirement, and many of us maybe are not super jazzed about having to do a whole bunch of math all semester. I get it. What I'm going to hope that we can kind of introduce today and reinforce throughout the semester is the possibility that this is all necessary and that it actually helps us quite a bit to make good, strong inferences about what is true and what is not. So let's get right to it. Why do we need good research methods? Do we even need good research methods in psychology? Why do we need to be disciplined and systematic about how we make inferences in psychological science? To answer this question, it's a good idea for us to think about what we have to go on, what our sources of psychology related knowledge are in the absence of sort of a rigorous and disciplined practice of research. So think about sort of different sources of knowledge about psychological phenomena. So maybe just thinking about how would your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner be reasoning about human nature, right? Like, what are our sources as human beings of insight into how we as a species behave? The three that we're going to talk about are common wisdom, personal experience, and intuition and reasoning. So, we're going to kind of go through each of these, and spoiler alert, I am going to make a case that each of these is fundamentally insufficient for us to understand how the human mind and human behavior work. So let's talk about common wisdom. So what's kind of useful actually about the study of psychology is that we can use psychological studies to show why these various heuristics are not useful. So we're actually going to be going through some psychological data to talk about why common wisdom and personal experience in particular are not going to always be useful guides for us. So think about common wisdom. One source of common wisdom that sort of, we can kind of take truisms about human behavior from are proverbs. So there was a famous study showing how people responded to various proverbs. So suppose that you're in this study and somebody puts this proverb in front of you. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Okay, maybe you agree with this. And maybe you think it describes some fundamental aspect of the human experience that, as we spend less time with certain people, we begin to miss them or become more fond of them. You're making an inference about human behavior. That all looks great. But then they show you this proverb: out of sight, out of mind. From this, you could make another inference about human behavior, which is that as soon as we stop seeing someone, we basically forget that they exist. We don't care about them anymore. In the sort of seminal study that was done in sort of the mid 80s that kind of looked at how people respond to these proverbs, a majority, an overwhelming majority actually, rated this proverb as true. They also rated this proverb as true. So what this kind of gives us evidence of, sort of tentative evidence of, is this idea that we might believe a whole bunch of kind of truisms about how human beings behave, and they might be mutually inconsistent. And that might make us less confident in them. Let's do another one. So here we have one: birds of a feather flock together. Again, a truism about human behavior that you might believe. And if we were to show the average person this proverb, they would rate it as true. Then if we distracted them for 5 minutes with a whole bunch of other tasks and made them forget that they even said that, and we showed them opposites attract, they would probably also say that's true. We would probably think that both of these things are true without really stopping to think about how they're mutually inconsistent. So again, our truisms about human behavior are not necessarily always accurate, and sometimes they are mutually contradictory. So the proverb study actually had a bunch of different proverbs in it. So those are all real proverbs. They actually had some that were made up. So they got people to endorse some proverbs that don't exist and never have. So love is stronger than fear. and wise men make proverbs and fools repeat them, right? So these are two proverbs that make sense, especially the second one, right? People tend to sort of rate these highly as likely to be true. They also tended to rate the exact opposite. Fear is stronger than love. Okay, I could see possibly holding those two as both being true, kind of like the ones that we just saw. But this one was my personal favorite. People tended to rate this hopefully not true proverb as true. Fools make proverbs and wise men repeat them. We kind of hope that that's not true, right? Like, just as people who sort of want humanity to be okay. We don't want fools making proverbs and then all the smart people running around and repeating them. That would not be great. But people did, in the majority, rate this as true. All of this to say, our common wisdom isn't always accurate. So let's talk about the second source of knowledge about human behavior that we are able to access without doing research, and that is our own personal experience. So here too, we can look at some evidence that will tell us that maybe using our personal experience to guide our understanding of human behavior is not always the smartest move. Okay, so about 20 years ago, there was a study where they were looking at how people explained their own personal decisions. So what they did is they showed people pictures of two women and asked them to choose one. So they would say, choose the woman on the left versus the woman on the right. This person points, says, I choose the woman on the left. And then they wait a while and they, do some other tasks. And then later on, they say, okay, why did you choose this woman? But the kicker is, that's the woman on the right. So they're asking, why did you choose the woman on the right when in fact this person had chosen the woman on the left? So in general, people tended to come up with explanations that were grounded sort of in their own personal biases and their own personal preferences, even when the choice was wrong. So in other words, even if you didn't choose the woman on the right, you're going to be able to concoct some reason why you did. So some of the reasons that people gave were, I chose her because she looked like my aunt. She seems nicer than the other one. I chose her because I'd rather approach her at a bar than the other one. Plus, I like her earrings. So this too provides us with some degree of evidence that, we don't always understand our own behavior, and we are able to come up with reasons why we did all sorts of things. So maybe using our personal experience is not the best source of broad general knowledge about human behavior. Now let's talk about our third sort of source of knowledge that we have access to about human behavior without research methods, and that's intuition and reasoning. Well, you already know what I'm going to say, which is that this too is pretty flawed. So our intuition and reasoning abilities are, how do I say this, not so great. Now, that is not sort of making a judgment about any one person, right? I am talking as a species, as just humanity. We are prone to all types of bias that make relying on our own intuition maybe not always the best move. So one of the many biases we can talk about is what's called the simulation heuristic. So they give somebody a possible scenario where there's a lottery for a $20 prize. So there's only 10 tickets and each one costs $1. So again, the prize is potentially $20. It costs $1 to enter and there's 10 tickets out there. So most people will typically enter this lottery. They'll say, that sounds great, sign me up. It turns out that if you tell people, okay, $20 prize, $1 to enter, there are 10 tickets. Oh, but this other guy over there, this other person has all of the other 9. So it's not just that there's 10 tickets in unknown locations throughout the earth. You know that somebody else has 9 out of the 10 tickets. People will typically not play. in this case. So in other words, if you tell them some other guy has 9 of those tickets, they'll say, oh, no, I don't want to play. Why? Because if you can actually imagine a situation where somebody else has an advantage over you, and you can actually imagine the person who has those 9 lottery tickets, who has a 9 times greater chance than you do of winning this lottery, you're much more likely to sort of count yourself out, even though the prizes and the costs are the exact same in both scenarios. So we're not objective, we're not purely rational. So our intuitions and heuristics, and when I say heuristic, I mean just sort of a guideline for how to think about something, can undermine our reasoning. And additionally, our reasoning itself can be biased. So these are some very kind of direct tests of how people behave in these situations. But we can kind of imagine that if we combine all of these biases together and all of these sort of little things that are slightly flawed about our thinking together, we can start to explain some behavior that is maybe a little bit more familiar to us. So, for instance, in studies about how people reason through political problems, it has generally been found that, so if you say to a participant who rates themselves as liberal, if you say, here are 5 political passages, here are 5 arguments made by peers of yours with varying political persuasions, find the logical inconsistencies in them. Well, they are much more likely to find logical inconsistencies in articles written by conservatives, or articles that just have a conservative point of view. Conversely, conservatives are more likely to identify logical flaws in liberals' arguments, right? And this comes down to, again, not something that's moral, not something that is, anything that we can really pass judgment on in any way. It's just kind of a feature of being a human being that some part of us always kind of sees what we want to see. In general, we reason as lawyers do, right? So if you think of all of the legal TV shows that you watch, I don't know if that's still a thing that people do, but I know that I have seen plenty of Law and Order in my time, right? You sort of imagine how lawyers argue for or against somebody's innocence or guilt, right? You have the conclusion at the end, right? You want this person to be innocent, or you want them to be guilty, or you want someone to be liable, and you argue toward that point. So this kind of biased reasoning strategy has a name, maybe you've heard it before, it's confirmation bias. And that is seeking only information that supports what you already believe to be true or have some stake in being true. Okay, so hopefully these slides have maybe helped to convince you a little bit, not that humans are not smart and capable, but that we have our flaws and we have our biases, right? So we have our flaws in how we reason about the world. Now, this creates a problem for those of us studying psychology. Why? Because if we're trying to study human nature, but we ourselves are flawed humans, how are we going to guard ourselves against making really bad decisions? And how are we going to guard ourselves against sort of making inferences that are untrue and are based on these biases that we have just as human beings? Well, spoiler alert, the way we're going to guard ourselves is by having research methods that are strong and having a good command of them. Yay! But it's important for us to sort of talk about what makes psychology a science and why we need these things. So, psychology is not common sense, knowledge from our personal experience, or sort of armchair theorizing, right? It's not using common sense, personal experience, or sort of logic, reasoning through things that you think might as well be true to draw conclusions.